Hello, my name is Bob Palmer, coming to you from the History Center of Olmsted County, which celebrates its 100th anniversary this year. This is one of 12 conversations with local historians and members of the History Center staff. We will also take a look at events in and around Rochester, the year the Historical Society formed.
To learn more about what's happening at the History Center, visit olmstedhistory.com.
Today we visit with Emily Neville and Kelley Gammel, creators and hosts of the podcast Whining About Herstory. Then the Olmsted County Newsreader will take a look at some of the stories making news in Rochester 100 years ago this month. First, could each of you tell me a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, so I'm Emily.
I'm Kelley.
And we have been the co-hosts of Whining About Herstory for 6 years now. Neither of us are historians or formally educated. We really
We're
love...
formally educated, just not
in that
history.
way.
Yeah.
It's like,
I was going to say, my degree has to count for something. But we are both just like, we've always been interested in history and especially obscure history. And this was a really good excuse for us to get together, especially when our lives are so busy and everything's crazy, and to educate ourselves. And it's actually been a really wonderful experience because... Mostly.
You know, there's some depression and other things mixed in just because of these stories.
I mean, I think that would be hitting regardless.
Yeah.
But just the way that we're able to view current day events now with such a more in-depth historical lens has been really valuable.
Yeah.
Well, you say you've always been interested in history, but isn't there a starting point? What really sparked this interest in history?
Like, specifically for the podcast or general interest in history?
Let's start with general and then we'll get to the specific.
I mean, I think we're both kind of into a little different thing. For me, it was, I can distinctly remember in, grade school really being interested in, particularly Egyptian history and, Cleopatra and, ancient history. And I think ever since then, I've always been interested in some history. But for me, I think it started with, ancient Egypt and then just kind of, evolved from there because, I don't know, just learning about other societies, particularly societies that, aren't around anymore, has just always fascinated me.
And I've always been into really spooky and dark things. So I was a kid at the library checking out picture books on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and the American Civil War and World War II. And I had to get special permission from my parents to check out books on the Holocaust from the school library. I've always really been interested in the darker side of history. And unfortunately, women's history intersects with a lot of dark stuff.
Yeah. So, which leads us to the podcast. And what brought you together and made this project work?
Well, what originally brought us together is we actually met in college. We lived down the hall from each other, and...
Well, where were you going to school?
We went to UW River Falls.
Okay.
For college, and yeah, that's where we met. She's actually known me longer than my husband, a fact that she's very proud of. But obviously, this podcast didn't start till we were out of school and stuff, and we had kept in contact. We obviously both moved to Rochester, her returning and me for the first time, but we had been kind of talking about maybe doing a true crime podcast, because that's something we're passionate about. But one, there's a ton of true crime podcasters, and two, we're both I don't know if I can handle the emotional baggage that comes with true crime podcasts. And so we kind of had let it lie for a little while, and then almost simultaneously we were hey, remember how we mentioned doing a podcast where I found this woman on Facebook that the French government just completely erased, and what if we cover that? And it turned out we were talking about the same woman. We had seen the same post, and it's Emily's first episode, A Lampe de Gouges, who is, a French woman that spoke out against the French government and was executed.
She was executed and thrown in a hole with a bunch of other people who were executed during the French Revolution.
And the French were just you don't exist anymore.
Yeah, they really tried to erase her from their entire history from the face of the earth, but her story endured. And so we were really then interested in this idea of women who had an impact on history who we haven't heard of for one reason or another, whether it's because their work was stolen by someone more prominent, whether they were erased, by the government.
Just due to being a woman, their story never got out. That also just happens, There's also the intersection of race, sexual identity, that has led to a lot of these women being purposely omitted from our history.
Yeah. What were some of the things you had to overcome to get this podcast off the ground?
Life. But I mean, scheduling as adults, because this isn't we've been doing it for 6 years, but it's neither of our full-time jobs. We both have full-time day jobs, so figuring out when to fit it in, both the research and writing of our scripts, but also the time it takes to record, because our episodes are at minimum an hour, at maximum 2.5 sometimes.
Yeah. It's so trying to, it takes a lot more work to produce a podcast, even our very low production value podcast, than I think either of us thought it would. If we knew how much work it was going to be, I don't think either of us would have gotten into it, but now we've been doing it for 6 years, and I don't think we know any other way to be.
I think we found a nice rhythm of how we do it now that is not overly stressful for either of us and fits well into our lives.
Yes.
You mentioned scripting. Are you scripting both parts, or are you using outlines, or you've been doing it now for 6 years? Is there just the handoffs are just natural to you?
So
as our transitions are usually natural, because I don't think either of us writes how we go from one of us to the other, but we each write our scripts separately, so we each cover one woman an episode, and we usually don't even tell each other who we're covering, which has only actually surprisingly been a problem once, that we had the same person, and I had multiple people in my story, so I deferred it to Emily and just took her out of my piece. But I think we both have pretty well written out scripts, just because of the amount of research we have to do. But I think we both do some off-the-cuff stuff as well, and I know sometimes our intros are not as scripted, and we'll literally do it moment of, but I think that adds to the my feeling, the charm that is our podcast.
We've been friends for so long, over a decade, and we have this conversational style with each other, and really what we're doing is we're not trying to be this ultimate compendium of historical knowledge. We're telling each other a story, and we're having fun while doing it, and we're like, oh my god, this is just like that one time in college, and putting in anecdotes and just having a genuine conversation where we're both really engaged. And I think that actually helps people retain the information and the stories better than if they were just listening to us read a dry script.
Right.
And we have had a lot of listeners that have made comments that it's it feels like listening. It feels like I'm in a room listening to my two best friends have a conversation, and that's exactly what we were aiming for, and so it's nice to see that come across.
What draws you to the people that you report on, the ladies that you report about, and is there a difference in what each of you, how you approach this?
I would say each of us have our own special interests. So Kelley is an extensive interest in psychology. So and gaming and tech. So she really is drawn to the women in those fields. I'm definitely a little more of a social justice girly, especially LGBTQ plus women. And so I get drawn to those stories. But one of the best things about this podcast is we've just become so open to letting stories find us. Anywhere you go and almost any interaction you have, you can find a woman's story in it. And then if you write the name down, take a little information, do a little Googling, you can have a script from it. And so we've both become a lot more open to finding women's stories in places where we may not expect.
Well, I think the other thing, too, is I think the thing I've discovered, and I think Emily has, too, is that, a lot of times when you find one woman's story, you'll find 2 or 3 mixed in with that one woman, because very, very rarely these women were doing things alone, but also like, especially in times where women didn't have a voice, the women tended to band together. So even if, like, there's been times where, like, I recently covered an LGBTQIA couple where they were both teachers, but they weren't allowed to be out, but they found each other. And so I covered one half of the couple like 1 week, and then like 2 weeks later I covered the other half, and it was, but we see that intersection of coming up. I have a few women there where it's like one was an architect, one designed solar panels, but they designed a solar house together, and I was researching one and found the other. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think like Emily said, like if you keep your eyes open, you can find those stories anywhere.
In the Memorial Day podcast, you discussed Major Megan McClung and Margaret Cochran. Could you share with us just a little bit about each one?
Yeah, so Major Megan McClung served overseas during Operation Iraqi Freedom. She was a really incredible individual. She was very athletic, and she was actually running satellite marathons in Iraq to coincide with ones that were happening stateside. And she created this thing called the Penguin Award, which the whole idea was it's not about finishing first, it's about finishing. So this award could be given to whoever finished last, because they did it. Finishing a marathon is just an incredible accomplishment. She was tragically killed in action. She is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. I actually got to go to DC recently, and I visited her grave, and people had left some flowers and letters and plastic bags. So she's definitely still very loved, not forgotten. And the reason I came across her story is because due to a recent executive order, the Arlington National Cemetery Instagram page has removed several posts about women and people of color from their Instagram, and a post about Major Megan McClung was one of them. And I grew up during, Operation Iraqi Freedom, and I remember hearing all of the stories of, the men and women serving and how heroic they were. And it really just turned my stomach to think that this woman, before our eyes, was actively being erased, quite literally. So I really wanted to take that opportunity to bring her story to light.
Okay.
My story, I was like, my story took place significantly longer ago than Emily's. So mine was actually during the Revolutionary War against the British. And this is not like a lone story. I actually found several women that had a very similar story where she followed her husband to war, not as like a camp follower or anything like that, but just because she didn't have anyone else. Like, she had no other family. She had no one to like be with. So she was like, well, you're going, well, I'm going to go with you. And he was a cannoneer, and she would like be with him, and he wasn't the one like firing the cannon, he was like the one loading it, and they had a name for it, and it was a really cool name, and I cannot think of it off the top of my head. But he fell in battle. He got hit by a cannonball from the British forces, and without hesitation, which I'm like, I would probably have a mental breakdown, but without hesitation, she stepped up into his position to keep the cannon firing. Unfortunately, the fort they were in did fall, and she was injured, but they let a lot of the prisoners go, her included, and she did actually end up being able to get like a military pension, which is something you do not see again for women for a very long time. And
definitely not without a lot of fighting.
Yeah, and she like, it was very small, but like she got one, and yeah, like she's pretty forgotten there. Like I said, she's not the only one that did that. There's several stories, but I know since like within the last few years there has been like a statue dedicated to her and stuff like that. But I just think it's these things that people like make comments that it like seems like only men, especially back then, were in these wars, but it's like no, women were right alongside them, and a lot of times had to fight whether they wanted to or not. And I just thought like that bravery of being able to just like stand up and do this thing, because you've been watching someone do it for so long, that there was no hesitation to like try to save everyone, even though her husband had just died.
One of the biggest misconceptions about world history, and especially American history, is that, well, this is what the men were doing and this is what the women were doing. when in fact there was so much crossover, there was so much intersection, and women were present and active participants in every major historical event, just like we are today. It's just the way the story is told, they're often omitted or they're treated like a special class where it's like, well, here's what all the men are doing. And then the women were over here talking about the right to vote, and that's all they were focused on. It's like, no, women have been in war, they've been in politics, they've been inventors, they've been in education. Like, you can't get rid of us. We're just everywhere.
Yeah. We might be in the background, but like, we're there.
Yep. Okay, your style is loose and chatty, just two women sharing a bottle of wine and talking history. It is light years from the dry, musty lectures most people visualize when you think of a history show. Do you think your approach may harbor a future trend to interest more people in thinking about history?
I do think so, because like, I think it's such a more approachable way. Like, I think, yes, if there's a topic you're really interested in or a particular person, you're probably eventually going to end up into the dry and musty just because that's where a lot of the information is. But I think this style, like the more casual and like overview style is a good way to, like you said, get people interested in it, because it is much more approachable. You don't have to go sit down in a lecture hall. You don't have to, you don't have to do the research yourself. You can kind of get the overview and then make the decision of like, oh, I want to learn more about this woman. Like, I'm going to go find books. Or I want to learn more about this period in history. I'm going to go find books. But I think if nothing else, it's a good intro. And we've gotten that feedback. And we always joke that like one of our only 1-star review is someone that made a comment and was like, this is not a serious history podcast.
I'm like, I thought the name would kind of tip you off.
Yeah.
I was like, and it's in our description that like we drink wine and we talk about history, and I'm like, if you think that's gonna be serious, that is not really our fault. Like we're not shy about the fact that we're not history majors and that we're not gonna we don't tone down stuff. And one of the things we always say too is like we share the woman's warts with like her wins. Like if a woman made questionable decisions, we're not just gonna gloss over that because we're covering her. It's like, no, this is who she was, and that's how all people are. And so I think that also helps feel more approachable, that we're not like, yes, we're saying women should be there, but we're not necessarily like pedestalizing them.
Yeah. And also, so many people think that they're not into history, but then they're super into like the Titanic or, Fatal Fashions or like the Victorian era. And it's like, history is everything. If you have an interest in anything today, you have an interest in history. And it's really just finding your gateway. For me, it was the dark and awful things. For Kelley, it was ancient Egypt. For someone else, it could be fashion, it could be food history, all of these different things. And then through these women's stories, we're able to examine specific times in history without, trying to be like, well, let me just explain ancient Mesopotamia to you.
Yeah.
It's going to take 4 hours.
Right.
And it's really, we're storytelling. It's drama, it's gossip, it's legend. There's so many interesting dynamics. And it's stuff that people love. If you love gossip, you love history.
Yeah.
You're just not getting it in the right way.
Yep. In what ways has the History Center been a resource for you?
So the History Center is an incredible resource, especially for finding local women that I'm never going to find through a Google search. They host some really incredible events. There was actually a book reading once for the book, I believe it was called The Crusade for Forgotten Souls, and it was about Anne Glacé, who was in Rochester and helped to reform the Minnesota state hospitals in like the 1940s. I would have literally never heard of her. I would have never found her. And I love history of the Rochester State Hospital. It's so creepy. It's right up my alley. And getting that inspiration and even going to exhibits and writing down names that we see and then doing more reading about them. And then in the gift shop, there are so many books by local authors about local figures and especially local women who we would have never heard of otherwise.
Well, and also I've appreciated the last 3 years they've given us a chance to speak during Women's History Month, And that's been such a nice way to like meet locals and tell, like we've done either Rochester specific women or at least Minnesota women every time we've done it, and I know we've both been so appreciative to like have a place to like come and do it in person. And we do it in the mornings. It's coffee, not wine, but like it's been so nice to meet local people who then like share their own stories of like, oh, my grandma knew that person, or like, oh, there's this little bit, have you heard about this? And like that's been a really cool way to like connect what we do, which is very in our own studio and like online with like local people in Rochester. Because like I think every year we've had at least one person come up and be like, oh, I didn't know like we had local people doing this is so cool. And that's been just like a really good experience. And like I love that the History Center is so open to that. But also the books and everything have been so nice. Like we don't do deep dives, so we've never had a chance to really touch their archives, which I'm sure would be really nice. But like I've been able to find pictures online of stuff, or like the books in their gift shop, and it's just amazing.
I think for our first live show at the History Center, there was a book on Edith Graham Mayo that was written by a local author that Kelley actually relied heavily on for her source material. And we found out after
the author was in the audience.
The author was in the audience.
Which I was glad I found out after, because I was like, I probably would have had a heart attack and like not wanted to give my story.
That would have been incredibly intimidating to basically cite the author's work in front of them, but she seemed to enjoy it.
Yeah.
She at least was Minnesota nice about it.
Yeah.
Okay. Who is the most interesting woman each of you have reported on? Do you each have a favorite, or give me one, or give us one that we can talk about?
There are a lot of favorites for each of us, and it's interesting because each of us connects with these women in a different way, and maybe one just like really sticks with you. I'm going to pander a little. One of my favorites was local Alice McGaw. She was a nurse at the early Mayo Clinic, and at this time, when anesthesia was delivered, it was very like, there's chloroform on a cloth. They kind of like choke you out a little bit and hope it works.
It
and
was terrifying.
People are waking up, or they're getting overdosed and dying. Like anesthesia-related deaths were very common because the way of administering it was so medieval. So what Alice did was, while working as a surgical nurse with the Mayo brothers, she kind of ran her own clinical trials to develop a better way of administering anesthesia throughout the surgical process to keep the patient unconscious, but to also make sure that they were not overdosed. And in her entire time with the Mayo Clinic, hundreds of surgeries, they never lost a single patient due to anesthesia-related complications. And she worked directly with the Mayo brothers. She was referred by Edith Graham Mayo, whom she had gone to school with, and Edith left nursing when she married Charlie. And so also it's like these girl besties supporting each other. And she's one of the reasons that the Mayo Clinic got on the map the way it did, because they had such success with surgeries because they weren't killing people by accidentally choking them out.
I love that one. I don't know why it's like the episode I always go back to, and the woman I always go back to is literally the very first woman I ever talked about on our podcast, who was a woman named Sybil Luddington, who was a teenage girl during the Revolutionary War, and she did exactly what Paul Revere did, but longer, farther, at night in the rain.
Uphill both ways.
Yes, her story is contested. I feel like a lot of the ones we tell are, but like there are historical records to show that she did do most of what, like, obviously it's probably like exaggerated, but yeah, she was just a young girl who like lived on a farm near a town, and when the town got attacked, they came and got her dad because he was like the local militia person, but he was like, I sent them all home for the season because it was like farming season, and they lived in it, and then he's like, I need someone to go get them, like I can't leave because I need to like be here for the troops. And so she either volunteered or was told, and it was night, it was raining, and she took off and she made this like huge loop around this valley that they lived in. I can't remember the mileage, but like it took her like all night because she got back by like dawn, and she was able to like rally these men, and she was like 17 years old, so she was still a child herself. And we revisited our first stories this last year on our anniversary, and what I found really cool was the amount of information I could find on her 6 years ago and the amount of information I could find now has changed. And yeah, when I was reading, I was like, were these like available when we first started? And they weren't. Like, more people have been talking about her, and more people have been like telling her story, and I think that's so cool because it's deserved. Like, if we're gonna talk about Paul Revere and his midnight ride, like, why can't we talk about Sybil right alongside him if she did the same thing?
Well,
better.
And
longer, she's less problematic,
faster.
you know, like.
Okay, if you could live in another era in Olmsted County's past, what would it be and why?
We talked about this question yesterday, and like we were both kind of like, it's always hesitant. I feel like as a woman to be like, where would I want to live? Because it's like there's so many other like background things you have to think of, like how did they treat women in that era?
Could we vote?
Yeah, but I told Emily like I would want to be here. Like I should know the year because I've lived in Rochester long enough, but like the era of when the tornado came through Rochester and Mayo was really being founded, and the hospitals being founded, and like the nuns are coming in as nurses, and like I think it would just be so cool to be in that piece of history where all this like now like is a huge thing, but like when all this history is happening and kind of see it from that perspective of like, oh my gosh, yeah, like look at all these awesome things that are happening, and like watch this city like really bloom. I think that would just be so incredible.
Yeah, and assuming I can maintain all the rights that I have today, maybe have a
or
few
come
more.
Back. Visit and come back.
Yeah. If I can just be a fly on the wall, I think it would be really interesting to be in Olmsted County, kind of in Mayo's heyday, where you know Will and Charlie are active doctors. You've got figures like Edith Graham Mayo, Alice McGaw, Dr. Henry Plummer, because these are all people we've grown up knowing their names, knowing their stories, and it feels almost like they're not real people because they're legendary. They're represented in buildings named after them or in old black and white photos. Yep. So to be able to see them as flesh and blood human beings and to really, you know, get to see that day to day versus the legends that we're told, I think would be really cool.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Kelley. Thank you, Emily. That was incredibly interesting.
To hear more fascinating stories from Emily and Kelley, listen to their podcast, Whining About Herstory, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Now let's look at what was making news in Olmsted County in 1926 with the Olmsted County Newsreader. 2 Olmsted County men will serve on the committee organizing the State Historical Society's 5th Annual Convention. Dr. William J. Mayo and Bert W. Eaton were announced by the organization's president, Dr. William Watts Falwell. The convention is planned for Mankato on June 17th. Incomplete plans for the convention call for stops at Northfield and Faribault. The second reading of the city's new bread ordinance is set for this month. The proposed ordinance would require every loaf of bread sold in the city shall be 1 pound, 1 pound and 1/2, and 2 pounds, stamped on the loaf or the wrapper in large characters. Sellers of bread will be required to have scales for the bread to be weighed if the customer requests. Proponents of the bread ordinance allege short weight of the product at a number of baking concerns. The ordinance was proposed by local interest and is aimed to ensure that all bread loaves sold in the city are uniform. Clee's Grocery at 309 South Broadway has brooms for sale for 50 cents and 2 pounds of ginger snaps for 25 cents. Rochester's Dr. Charles Mayo, speaking in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, hailed the progress being made by medical science, allowing people to live until the age of 65. A news story in the Rochester Post and Record reported Dr. Mayo's remarks to the Philadelphia Forum at the Academy of Music that asserted that medicine was approaching the conquest of the last great scourge of the human family, cancer. The eminent surgeon noted how medical science has conquered yellow fever, cholera, rabies, typhoid fever, the plague, scarlet fever, and pneumonia. Dr. Mayo asserted that if the people of this country were to take advantage of the knowledge that medical science now offers them by virtue of its discoveries, they would be enabled to live to be 65 years old. Remember that only 50 years ago, the average length of human life was 45 years, and in the 16th century, only 30 years. The prominent Rochester physician hoped that recent German discoveries of blood markers for cancer would help detect cancer before the time when surgery was the only option. He considered the knife only a restraining aid, not a cure. The tiny house completed by Central School sixth graders in Miss Evelyn Meyer's class is nearing completion. The fully decorated and landscaped house is a little over 4 feet square. The wife of newly appointed Secretary of State Frank B. Kellogg, a former Olmsted County resident, will be spending a few days at her home at 633 Fairmont Avenue in St. Paul. Mrs. Kellogg was met at the station Sunday morning by her sister, Mrs. F.J. Otis. After breakfast, the sisters attended morning services at St. John the Evangelist on Portland Avenue, sitting in the Kellogg family pew. 1,400 children in Rochester have received the immunizing treatment to protect them from scarlet fever. The total is about half of the school population. If any parent would like to have their children receive the treatment, they may come to the health office any morning at 8:30 or by appointment. St. John's High School, Rochester's entry into the Tri-State Catholic basketball tournament fell to Loyola of Mankato 17-12. March saw Rochester businesses change hands. The B&W store sold to the Red Owl, and a move by the Boston Shoe Shine Parlor to a new location was noted in the Rochester Post and Record. Lon Chaney in Blackbird is playing at the Empress Theater. Tickets are 10 cents and 35 cents. Former County Commissioner O.M. Ketchum has filed to regain his 4th District seat in the November election. Mr. Ketchum will attempt to unseat J.H. Smith, who is expected to file for re-election. The 2nd District seat will also be filled in November. Julius Brooks, the current commissioner, has yet to file for re-election. The November ballot will also feature a contest for Olmsted County Sheriff between Sheriff S.J. Hawk and Thomas V. Nagel. State Representative H.P. Christensen has also filed for re-election. Back copies of the Rochester newspapers can be found at the History Center of Olmsted County, celebrating 100 years through 2026. Join us again in April when we learn about plans for a concrete highway between Rochester and St. Paul, and more news from Olmsted County's past.